We are thrilled that Walter Scheidel is joining us for this ceremony and that Professor Scheidel accepted the Oswald-Spengler-Prize. Scheidel is only the second nominee after it was awarded to Michel Ulbeck for the first time in 2018. And after we recognize the literary achievement of Michel Ulbeck, we're now recognizing the scholarly and scientific work of Walter Scheidel, one of the most original and far-reaching historians working today. Do we then recognize men in two entirely different fields? According to Oswald Spengler, no, because as Spengler expressed it in one of his many memorable quotes, history must be rhymed. What Spengler meant was probably that history is too complex to be boiled down to simple cause and effects accounts. History is being written for a certain time and audience. Every generation must find its own account. History is, after all, his story. And yet, at the same time, in the powerful opening passages of Der Untergang des Abendlandes, Decline of the West, Spengler claims to have developed the logic of history, a metaphysical structure of human history beyond all the casual and incalculable elements of the separate events. Spengler does world history present to the seeing eye certain grand traits again and again, with sufficient certainty to justify certain conclusions? And if so, what are the limits to which such reasoning might be pushed? Those sentences could be the work program of Walter Scheidel. As much as any historian alive today, Mr. Scheidel has been searching for the grand traits that appear again and again in human history, in different cultures, such as mechanisms of empire, economic structures, and fiscal regimes. In his endeavors, Scheidel is giving special attention to comparative analysis between the Roman Empire and ancient China, but also includes multiple time periods and regions. The whole world, so to say, is his oyster. When I met Walter Scheidel in New York City, he told me that quite a few historians do not like to teach world history because, in their own words, one needs to know too much. These would be the specialists, the Kathederwissenschaftler. Oswald Spengler already complained about this in his time. Walter Scheidel is anything but a Kathederwissenschaftler. He readily took up teaching world history at Stanford University. With The Great Leveler, he produced a definitive tome on economic inequality in human history for years to come, on the why, defining the work program for future historians. In the best tradition of Oswald Spengler in particular, and universal history in general, Scheidel analyzes data from the Roman Empire, ancient China, the Aztec and Inca empires, medieval times, Japan, and other historical periods. In the beginning of the book, he even goes back to the dawn of humanity to support his thesis and look for evidence. The central thesis of The Great Leveler, of course, is known and rather controversial, respectively disturbing. Given certain swings and fluctuations, inequality has risen in human history and was rising per capita income. When leveling towards a fairer distribution of wealth and income took place, it was mostly through what Scheidel calls the four horsemen: revolution, war, state collapse, and other plagues, with war being the most effective. Quite pessimistic, quite Spenglerian. Scheidel argues that the modern welfare state is a direct consequence of mass mobilization during the two world wars in the 20th century. If one is so inclined, one might point to Heraclitus and his famous dictum of war being the father of all things. Heraclitus is being cited in the book, but does not appear in the register. Again, we think about a connection to Spengler, who wrote his dissertation about Heraclitus. Incidentally, Scheidel manages to put a revisionist thesis right in our face by calling the period from 1914 to 1945 the 30 Years' War. This is a stunt very few people can pull off. There are many secondary theses or observations. For example, that states and state structures have mostly promoted inequality. Applying cold logic and leaving wishful thinking aside, this seems rather obvious. States are power structures to manage large aggregations of people. and power tends to accumulate. The more advanced the state, the larger the inequality, with the notable exception of the welfare states created in the 20th century. In 1919, Spengler described England and Germany, this is to say Prussia, as the two late and remaining vital states in Europe, the others having been spent during centuries of active history and rule, stating that among all the peoples of Western Europe, these two are distinguished by a rigid social hierarchy. England is structured along lines of wealth and poverty, Prussia along lines of command and obedience, which is rank. So for Spengler, development implies social differentiation. From a distance, this almost looks like a tautology, if it did not come with so much ideological baggage. In his Sapiens, Yuval Noah Harari makes a similar argument. These arguments, for reasons I will explain later, seem as intuitively natural to me as they may seem as unnatural to many contemporaries. I learned a lot through the rich case histories and succinct and far-reaching conclusions of the great leveler, and I was able to refine and correct quite a few of my own assumptions. Forager societies, for example, are relatively equal. That much has been known for a long time. I always assumed and argued inequality follows a sedentary and agrarian lifestyle. From Scheidel, I learned that inequality is not tied to farming lifestyle, but is even more a universal trait in our species. It is the existence of surplus as well as property rights, heredity that can make for great inequality even in nomadic societies. Abraham and his wealth immediately spring to mind. Once explicitly stated, this is obvious, but it needs someone to state it first. One of the many firsts in Scheidel's work. I also learned in the more technical annex of the great leveler that the Gini coefficient is not the right way to think about the distribution of income and wealth, but rather the extraction rate, the way the additional surplus beyond subsistence level or a culturally accepted minimum of standard of living is being distributed in society. In present times, inequality is making its comeback as a political topic big time, as are Keynesian politics and the resurgence of the state. As the middle class is dwindling, the distribution of income and wealth is getting increasing attention. Even Fortune magazine, hardly a socialist journal, devoted a well-researched title story to the shrinking middle class and concludes the upshot of, I add, the breakup of unions, outsourcing and tax reforms that favor the rich in the past 4 decades, now Fortune. The upshot, an economic order in which the capital-owning class enjoys great advantages, and the costs of admission to and exclusion from that class grow ever higher. Once again, this is Fortune. This is not Vorwärts. More than a decade ago, billionaire investor Warren Buffett famously stated that it's class warfare and it's my class, the rich class, that is winning. And it shouldn't, was his implication. Equality and inequality as a topic of public debate is coming back big time, as are Keynesian politics and fiscal policy. I mentioned that. In a historical study of 48 debt crisis, longtime macro hedge fund manager and multi-billionaire Ray Dalio finds evidence that populism is highest when the distribution of wealth is most unequal. For example, in the 20s and 30s, and again, currently. In this situation, Walter Scheidel's perspective on current political and economic developments is in high demand. In May of this year, upon special request, he published an article in Foreign Affairs, still the journal on international politics, on the effect of COVID-19. In later articles, Scheidel argued that instead of being a great leveler, the current COVID pandemic will intensify existing inequalities drastically. This argument is being reiterated by Klaus Schwab, head of the World Economic Forum in Davos, in his book COVID-19, The Great Reset of June of this year. And indeed, in addition to the surveillance state foreseen by the Rockefeller Foundation in 2010, the virus greatly amplifies existing inequalities. One simple example: many members of the upper middle class can homeschool their children and work from the home office, whereas members of the lower ranks of society cannot. Inequality is now approaching a level not seen since the early decades of the 20th century. So let me forecast that Walter Scheidel will be in demand for a considerable time to come, if he chooses to do so. There may be moments, however, when political expediency might be an incentive to sacrifice academic integrity. I have a rather clear notion of how our laureate would decide in those instances, and my hunch is that academic integrity will always go first. In Preußentum und Sozialismus, written around 1917 or 18, Oswald Spengler left us memorable quotes about the billionaire class, especially in America in his time. For example, the American billionaires are private citizens which rule countries by a subordinate class of professional politicians. Then billionaires were still weighed and measured in the single digits, I might add. It's a little higher now. Or, quote 2, the billionaire demands total liberty to deal with the global order according to his private decisions, without any other ethical yardstick than success. In place of authoritarian socialism, the Anglo-Saxon billionaire puts a grand private socialism with charitable donations in grand style, through which he once again enjoys his own power and vanquishes the receiving people morally too. And finally, the billionaire socialism would transform a people into an army of private officials without it being noticed. Even today, the big trusts are private states which exercise a protectorate over the official state. The huge compliance bureaucracies of private companies, of auditing firms, all that comes to mind. COVID-19, Bill Gates, and the WHO come to mind also, and others, quite eerie. Let me come to the third and last part. Back to history. Walter Scheidel is not afraid of asking the grand questions, and based on an immense knowledge and highly original mind, proposes some answers. This is what history should do. In his remarks on this occasion, David Engels criticizes Karl Popper's stance on history as ultimately nihilistic, a point of view I wholeheartedly share. If one does do history the way Scheidel does, one is bound to come across certain laws of history or cyclical patterns, something that takes originality and knowledge, and in our times, unfortunately, also courage. Delius' study on big debt crisis is noteworthy and enjoys a quote and contains a quote our laureate will enjoy and Oswald Spengler would also have enjoyed, I hope. So Delius says, I find that whenever I start talking about cycles, particularly big long-term cycles, people's eyebrows go up. The reactions I elicit are similar to those I'd expect if I were talking about astrology. For that reason, I want to emphasize that I'm talking about nothing more than logically driven series of events that recur in patterns. And this brings us to another important nexus between Scheidel and Spengler. Their history is grounded in a socio-biological perspective, recognizing that humanity as a whole is bound by the genetic and cultural limits of our species. For a long time, Scheidel taught human biology at Stanford until the demands of a politically correct curriculum made it difficult to do so. In Spengler, humanity as a whole has no goal, no idea, no plan, as little as the genuses of orchids or butterflies have plans. Humanity is a zoological term or an empty word. So it's a zoological term, a biological term. Both would share the assessment of Edward O. Wilson, who started the rebirth of sociobiology in the 1970s with a seminal book on human nature. So Wilson, we are one biological species springing from the Earth's biosphere, an adapted species of many, And however splendid our languages and cultures are, however rich and subtle our mind, however great our creative powers, our mental process is the product of a brain formed by the hammer of natural selection upon the anvil of nature. Later, Wilson specifies, we can say with great certainty that the genetic evolution of human social behavior happened mostly during the 5 million years prior to the dawn of civilization, when mankind consisted of dispersed and relatively immobile hunter and gatherer populations. By contrast, the largest part of cultural evolution took place since the development of agriculture some 10,000 years ago. During this historical spurt, a certain limited genetic evolution must have happened, but it cannot have formed more than a minuscule part of human nature. It is therefore not surprising that Scheidel begins the great leveler with insights from the animal kingdom and prehistoric time to put inequality in historical times into perspective. The socio-biological perspective is also shared by our first laureate, Michel Ulbeck. In his prize speech, Ulbeck recounted that he had an excellent professor in evolutionary biology during his studies as an agricultural engineer, and that the insights from biology shaped his thinking. Scheidel's new book, Escape from Rome, which I still have to read, is of course in the best Spenglerian tradition. Its main hypothesis is that it were the discontinuities with Rome that allowed for the rise of Western civilization, not the continuities. So Rome and the West are two separate entities. That such entities, civilizations, might grow like plants according to a preset program is of course Spengler's main claim. The rise and fall of civilizations might follow rules set by human sociobiology, a field that certainly needs much more research. Maybe sometime we can find the logic behind the sequence of events seen in the rise and fall of civilizations. It is also not surprising that Scheidel's theses have been labeled pessimistic, a label that was also quickly applied to Oswald-Spengler. In view of human nature and biology, they should be termed realistic. Aggression and kindness both belong to our species, as Stanford biologist Robert Sapolsky reminds us in a recent and widely read book. So do hierarchies. Often people seem to be outright uncomfortable if they cannot place themselves in a proper hierarchy. I recommend The Broken Ladder by UNC psychologist and experimental neuroscientist Keith Payne, who explains on that phenomenon in depth and cites a lot of studies. Based on science, we do not have hard evidence that the future with regard to violence will be much different from the past. If this is pessimism, so be it. Spengler denounced wishful thinking in politics, history, and social sciences. For any time and age, there would be certain tasks set that can be accomplished, while it would be futile to pursue others. It would be futile today, for example, to aspire to be Beethoven, although computer programs can replicate his work pretty well already. So we need a clear and realistic picture of what we can accomplish and what is out of reach. I quote Spengler, "The West European, however historically he may think and feel, is at a certain stage invariably uncertain of his own direction. He gropes and feels his way, and if unlucky in environment, he loses it." Well, Walter Scheidel is one of the lucky few to which Spengler's quote definitely does not apply. When I met Walter in Manhattan last week, I met a highly independent thinker who chose his own path early on and then boldly took it. As our laureate told me, he was fascinated by history from early on. His parents were not especially interested in academics, and there were few books at his home. But the ones he read time and again. And he stayed his course, reaching academic Mount Olympus by his own abilities and endurance, and still staying true to himself. If one can achieve what Walter Scheidel did through ability, willpower, and determination, not all is lost in the West. Walter Scheidel, we recognize your truly outstanding achievements. We commend you, we applaud you, and we encourage you to proceed with your work as undeterredly as you have done in the past. It is a privilege and an honor for our society to award you with the second Oswald-Spengler-Prize, and I will do that. So the text reads, this is to certify that on 13th of November, which is a Friday, by the way, 2020, Walter Scheidel has been awarded the Oswald-Spengler-Prize 2020 by the board of the Oswald-Spengler Society for the Study of Humanity and World History. David Engels, President, Gerd Morgenthaler, Secretary, Max Otte, Treasury. Walter Scheidel, once again, we congratulate you, and we now drink a virtual toast to you, and later on we'll drink real wine. I'm sure you would have enjoyed it, but we cannot send it across the internet, so we'll have to wait for a suitable occasion. Congratulations, and we eagerly expect your remarks.